Hey there, folks! Today we're going to talk about a topic that is still somewhat taboo in our society: menstruation. I know you're probably thinking, oh great, here comes another awkward conversation about periods. But don't worry, I will keep things light and informative. Today we're going to take a journey through time and explore the evolution of menstrual products. Trust me, it's going to be bloody fascinating. Even though nowadays we have access to disposable pads and tampons, the truth is that these products haven't been around for that long. In fact, for centuries, women had to come up with their own ways of dealing with their periods. So let's dive into the history of menstrual products and find out what women did in the past to cope with their periods. Even today, talking about menstruation can be a touchy subject for some people, especially young girls who may feel embarrassed to ask their parents about it. However, things were even more complicated in the past. In fact, for a long time, there wasn't even a proper term to describe menstruation, let alone any products to help women deal with it. Historians believe that before the 20th century, menstruation was a relatively rare occurrence for women. Most of their time was spent either giving birth or breastfeeding. Plus, their diets were often so poor that their periods could disappear due to malnutrition. As a result, a woman might only have 10, 15 periods in her entire lifetime. But just because periods were infrequent, that didn't mean they weren't challenging to deal with. In fact, throughout history, women had to come up with all sorts of creative solutions to manage their periods. For example, in ancient times, women would isolate themselves in separate huts during their periods. Can you imagine that? It's like being grounded for a week every month, but without the luxury of Wi-Fi or Netflix. In ancient Egypt, women used papyrus to make tampons. Yes, you heard that right. Papyrus. I guess when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade, but seriously. Can you imagine using something that's meant for writing to absorb blood flow? Talk about being resourceful. In ancient Greece, women made tampons out of small sticks wrapped in soft fabric. They also used moss or sea sponges instead of tampons. I don't know about you, but that sounds like something I would use as a DIY project on Pinterest, not as a way to handle period. Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder wrote that women during their periods had extraordinary powers, such as the ability to summon lightning or destroy crops with just a look. And in ancient Rome, women used wool for tampons. You know what else is made out of wool? Sweaters. So essentially, women in ancient Rome were shoving sweaters up their vaginas. I don't know about you, but that's not exactly what I had in mind when I heard the phrase fashion statement. Middle Ages. Back then, the word menstruation didn't even exist, and women were considered dirty and dangerous during their period. The mere idea of menstrual blood was enough to send people running for the hills, convinced that the devil was lurking around the corner. So if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, chances are you spent most of your period alone in a corner somewhere, trying not to infect anyone with your womanly curse. But fear not, ladies, you weren't completely defenseless. To deal with your monthly woes, you had a variety of options at your disposal. For instance, you could stuff pieces of cloth between your legs and hope for the best. If you were lucky enough to be a noblewoman, you could afford fancy menstrual pads made of fine linen or even rabbit fur. Yes, rabbit fur, don't ask. But if you were a peasant, you had to get creative. Some women made do with whatever fabric they had lying around, like scraps of old clothing or pieces of wool. And if you were really desperate, you could always try a dead frog. Yes, you heard that right. Apparently, hanging a dried-out frog around your waist was supposed to make your cramps go away and your period less heavy. Hey, don't knock it till you try it. Of course, not everyone was a fan of the frog trick. In fact, some people thought it was downright dangerous. They believed that menstrual blood was a poison that could infect the whole body and make you sick. So, to avoid this fate, they advised women to avoid contact with men during their period and to stay away from any food that might spoil or rot. Because apparently menstrual blood could make bread go bad. Who knew? Menstruation in the Middle Ages, a time when dead frogs were a viable period solution, bread was afraid of blood, and nobody knew what the hell was going on. The 17th century. Time went on, menstruation continued, but even those involved in medicine and midwifery were afraid to talk about it. But the best part of all this? The fact that nobody even had a name for it. That's right, folks. The word menstruation didn't come into use until the 19th century. Before that, people just had to make do with euphemisms like the curse or Aunt Flo, and even then they didn't talk about it openly. In fact, doctors were so embarrassed by the subject that they often wrote about it in code or just didn't mention it at all. For example, there are records from midwife Jane Sharp in 1671. She describes menstruation without ever mentioning the process by name. Sometimes it flows too early, sometimes too late. Sometimes too much, sometimes very little. Sometimes it happens that they do not flow at all. Thanks for the detailed medical advice, lady. So there you have it, folks. The 18th and 19th, the first centuries. In the 18th century, women wore special pants made of thick fabric. However, they rarely used these items. Why? Because girls were married off early, after which their lives usually consisted of a continuous cycle of pregnancy and lactation. Thus, from menarche to menopause, they usually had no more than 10 menstrual cycles. For comparison, a modern woman menstruates up to 12 times a year. Meanwhile, by the mid-19th century, some progress had been made in women's hygiene. Fabric pads made of cotton and flannel were becoming increasingly popular, and a certain rubber hygienic belt appeared, one of the straps of which passed between the legs and was supposed to prevent blood leakage. They did their job. Clothes and furniture where women sat remained clean, but wearing it was not very comfortable. The end of the 19th century was marked by a truly revolutionary event. The first sanitary feminine pad was invented. Lister's towels offered women a ready-made product that could be bought at pharmacies. But the invention failed miserably. Women were ashamed to buy such a thing, and sales did not take off. World War I was a turning point for medical advancements, and menstrual hygiene was no exception. Sanitary workers came up with the idea of using cellulose for pads, and Kotex turned it into a booming business. To make women more comfortable buying pads, Johnson & Johnson even invented a special scheme where they could grab a box off the shelf and toss a coin in a designated slot. Smart, right? And then, drum roll please, tampons hit the market. Though they were far from perfect, women preferred them for their convenience. It wasn't until 1931 that Earl Haas invented a cotton tampon with an applicator, borrowing the idea from his friend who had created something similar. And that's not all. Haas went on to invent the diaphragm for birth control. Talk about an overachiever. Tampons continued to evolve, becoming more and more popular for their compactness and ease of use. But not all was well in tampon land. In the 70s, Procter & Gamble released the most absorbent tampon in the world, which sounds great. But we now know that prolonged tampon use can lead to toxic shock syndrome. So let's stick to the instructions and not push our luck. Last but not least, menstrual cups may seem like a recent invention, but the first one actually appeared in 1930. And despite their popularity today, they were once advertised as obnoxious rubber contraptions. Oh, how times have changed. So there you have it, folks. A brief history of menstrual products throughout the ages. While it's certainly nice to have access to disposable pads and tampons these days, it's important to remember that women throughout history had to come up with their own solutions to deal with their periods. It just goes to show how resourceful and resilient women can be, even in the face of adversity. Thanks for joining us on this journey through feminine hygiene history. Subscribe for more fascinating tales from the past. It's time to channel your inner Indiana Jones and explore the weird and wonderful world of history with us. If you're a fan of all things bizarre, then don't be shy. Hit that comment section and let us know what fascinating topics you want to see us delve into next. The stranger, the better. So come on, don't leave us hanging like a cliffhanger ending.